about Seattle and Spokane, Washington. Peter Pollak is an urban and environmental planner based in Boulder, Colorado. From 2006 to 2018, he managed the Western programs for the Lincoln Institute of Land Policy. He worked for almost 25 years for the city of Boulder, and he served as director of the city's planning department from 1999 to 2006. Pollak has presented his research on the work of Frederick Olmsted Jr. in Boulder at the NAOP Symposium on FLO Jr. in Washington, D.C. in 2013, and at the 17th National Conference on Planning History by the SACRPH, he can tell you what that is, in Cleveland in 2017. The second session by Natalie Perrin and Chrisanne Beckner is about Seattle and Spokane. Natalie Perrin is Historic Research Associate, President-elect, and Principal Architectural Historian, and she manages the HRA Eugene, Oregon office. After joining HRA in 2008, she served as Principal Investigator on numerous cultural resources management projects, including historic structures reports for properties listed on the National Register of Historic Places, National Register nominations, historic building survey and historic American engineering reports, historic property management plans, design reviews, restoration and rehabilitation consulting projects, and surveys with Section 106 evaluations. With specialized training in building conservation technology, Natalie is particularly adept at evaluating historic structures from the ground up. Chrisanne Beckner is Senior Architectural Historian at Historic Research Associates. She joined the firm in 2013 and recently took over management of HRA's Architectural History program. She surveys and evaluates buildings, structures, and park landscapes and prepares cultural resources technical reports in support of public and private projects, including those in transportation, energy, and hydroelectric fields. She's listed numerous properties in the National Register, including in partnership with Natalie Perrin, Seattle's Olmsted Brothers designed Lake Washington Boulevard. Perrin and Beckner also prepared multiple property documents for Olmsted Parks and Boulevards in both Seattle and Spokane, Washington. And now I give you Peter Pollak. Thank you.
Good morning, folks. I'm about to take you 2,000 miles west and to the foothills of the Colorado Rocky Mountains, where Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. did a plan of improvements for Boulder, Colorado in the early 1900s. So we're going to get a little more grounded in space and look at some details of the work that they did there and the way that the legacy of that work has fared over time. So I appreciate the invitation to present today. It's opportunities like this that give me a chance to dig deeper into this story of Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. and the improvement of Boulder, Colorado. My interest in this subject is shaped by a love of place. I've been a 40-plus year resident of Boulder with a professional curiosity of how Boulder became the Boulder of today, especially in the realm of city and environmental planning. I offer this not as a trained historian interested in city planning, but as a trained and an experienced city planner interested in history. My goal is to address these four things. What was going on in Boulder in the early 1900s that led a citizens group to bring Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. to Boulder? 2, who were those people? 3, what did FLO Jr. contribute to the effort to plan for improvements to Boulder? And 4, what were the results and lasting legacy of Olmsted's planning efforts, and in what ways does this reflect the best and worst of our community? So probably for this audience, I don't need this kind of introduction, but we're talking here about the son, Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., and I'm going to use FLO Jr. or Olmsted Jr., or occasionally I may lapse into just saying Olmsted. But understand, this is Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. to whom I'm referring. So how does Boulder fit into FLO Junior's career progression? I've combined the table of contents from Elizabeth Hope Cushing's new FLO Junior biography to show the rough outline of Olmsted Junior's career with a list of his city plans in Susan L. Claus's 1991 article about the city planning reports of FLO Junior that shows generally where his Boulder work fits into his larger career. The Boulder city planning work is one of several city planning projects he undertook in the early 1900s, including Detroit, Utica, Pittsburgh, New Haven, Rochester, and Newport. Biographers have pointed to Olmsted's frustration with his city planning work because of the long time frames called for to realize his suggested improvements, and often the lack of a professional to see them through. This was certainly the case in Boulder. Note also that the clients for his city plans were usually citizen associations or committees and not the official working of city government. This was also the case in Boulder. Let's turn, however, to the people who occupied Boulder before the name Boulder was ever used. I acknowledge that my home in Boulder is on the ancestral homelands and unceded territory of the Apache, Arapaho, Cheyenne, Comanche, Kiowa, Pawnee, Shoshone, Sioux, and Ute. I honor and respect the people of these nations and their ancestors. European settlement along the Front Range of Colorado exploded in 1858 because of the discovery of gold. Town builders initially sought ways in which to profit from the hard work of gold seekers. At the same time, immigrant colonies, such as the Union Colony in Greeley, primarily attracted agriculturalists. As the fortunes of the mines and farms ebbed and flowed, communities sometimes disappeared or reinvented themselves to develop a more sustainable economy. When I look at Boulder's history after Europeans arrived, I think of four major phases of development, all based on changing visions of what Boulder should be. Boulder initially served as a mining supply town for the mining activity up in the foothills. The 59ers flooded into what was then Nebraska and Kansas territory, and the town was developed to supply their needs. As mining activity waned, Boulder began to look for ways to sustain and grow their economy. A variety of efforts were made to attract and develop institutions related to education, health, and tourism. FLO Junior's planning work helped guide the way to the development of the university town as a city of fine homes with limited manufacturing. This stayed quite stable until Boulder's post-World War II expansion, when the community decided to dramatically expand the area of the city and encourage the development of federal scientific labs and associated clean industry, and the housing and commercial development needed for new workers. Finally, Boulder today is largely shaped by environmental sensibilities, which politically erupted in the 1970s in reaction to the success of the post-World War II expansion. A wide variety of growth management policies signal a change in vision to a community that is concerned about sustainability and resilience in the face of climate change. Let's call this E-Town. I've read that Boulder at its founding in 1859 had a population of about 1,000 people, and the very next year it was 174 because all the surface gold had been picked over. At the beginning of 1900, Boulder was a city of 6,150 people, and by 1910, the city had a population of 9,539. The town seemed fixated on hitting the 10,000 person mark, and claims to that effect were made in newspaper and promotional booklets. You can see all the way to World War II, there was some growth, but in 1940, Boulder was still shy of 13,000 people. It's now a city of about 120,000. Colorado Territory was formed in 1861, and Boulder County was one of the original 17 counties. Boulder was named the county seat and incorporated in 1871. The state of Colorado, the Centennial State, was formed in 1876. Importantly, Colorado was the first state to enact women's suffrage by popular referendum in 1893. Votes by women played a significant role in the direction Boulder took in areas like temperance, enforcement of laws concerning morality, and the betterment of parks and schools. In the early 1900s, most of the town seemed united over the question of growth, since both the commercial interests, the so-called boosters, and those interested in improvements, beautification, and various moral causers, the improvers, wanted to grow. The question was, what kind of growth? The Boulder Commercial Association, founded in 1905, wanted to add more manufacturing to the mix and led a public subscription campaign to bring a sugar factory to Boulder in 1907, a campaign that failed. Boulder has a history of taking a direct hand in encouraging development consistent with its vision by dedicating land, either privately by individual citizens, as in the case of the university, or by popular vote to acquire the land for Boulder Chautauqua. The Hotel Boulderado was built through public subscription in order to provide a first-class hotel downtown. These are all listed properties on the National Register. Chautauqua is a National Historic Landmark. In 1890, the Boulder Improvement Society was founded, but seems to have had limited success. However, in 1903, the improvers organized themselves under the banner of the Boulder City Improvement Association, the BCIA. Their purpose was to cooperate with all other organizations and individuals engaged in the work of bettering and beautifying the town. So who were these people? Junius Henderson, the president of the BCIA, was a lawyer, judge, scientist, author, and curator. He came to Boulder in 1892 and served for 7 years as county judge. Henderson was appointed the curator of the University Natural History Collection in 1903. He earned a bachelor's degree from the university in 1906 and was named professor of natural history until his retirement in 1933. In his trip report of his visit to Boulder in 1908, Olmsted Jr. commented, "Met also Judge Henderson, a comparatively young man of much force and public spirit, interested in improvement matters in juvenile delinquency, etc., on which he gave a talk at Methodist Church Sunday." Eben G. Fine was vice president. He was a business leader, pharmacist, conservationist, mountaineer, ardent photographer, and tireless promoter of Boulder, and was known as Mr. Boulder. Fine was secretary of the Boulder Commercial Association from 1905 to 1907. During the period 1927 to 1935, he was secretary of the Boulder Chamber of Commerce. He was closely associated with the Colorado Chautauqua, and he served on their board for more than 50 years. He traveled extensively, lectured and extolling the virtues of Boulder, sponsored by the railroad company. For 14 years, he would spend 2 months every year giving presentations using glass lantern slides. He presented to over 3,500 audiences. Olmsted Jr. described him as a very active and enthusiastic improver. As secretary of the BCIA, Dr. William J. Baird was the sole correspondent with FLO Jr. over a 24-year period. He was a physician, philanthropist, progressive reformer, and promoter of city improvement and beautification. He held tenaciously to the recommendations of Olmsted, sometimes to the consternation of others in the community. He was born in Alabama in 1861 and first arrived in Boulder in 1893. He taught at the university, maintained a private practice, and specialized in the care of tuberculars. He gave a 160-acre park to the city at the mouth of Gregory Canyon in 1908. In newspaper accounts, he is called the father of paving and the park system. We do not have a photo of Baird, so I show his handwriting, which unfortunately for me as a researcher was horrible. Frederick Fred White was a businessman involved in mines, real estate, insurance, and loans. He was an ardent prohibitionist, running several times for state office on the prohibition ticket and serving on the Boulder City Council. Mr. White was born in Glasgow, Scotland in 1860 and was the only family member to immigrate to the United States. He arrived in Colorado in the spring of 1880 to look after his family's interests in mines in the Boulder foothills. He moved to Boulder in 1890 and took up his business dealings in real estate. The Boulder Daily Camera noted his service in moral and civic betterment issues. Maud Clark Gardner Odell was an advocate for the poor and sick, for good schools, and for parks. She served as the chair of the Standing Committee on Education on the BCIA. Born in Tennessee in 1869, she came west the next year as part of a pioneer family to the Union Colony in Greeley. She came to Boulder to attend the university in 1889 and graduated Phi Beta Kappa in 1893. She was a charter member of the Boulder Parks Board in 1907 and was elected to the school board in 1911. In 1908, Olmsted characterized her as a widow, very active, efficient, intelligent, and cultivated. While many of us in Boulder can understand the enthusiasm of the BCIA in asking for Olmsted Jr. to come to Boulder, it is a little more of a mystery as to why he wanted to come at all. Perhaps it was due to his youthful experiences in Colorado. As he reports in his Harvard Class of 1894 25th anniversary entry, before Class Day 94, I went off to the Rocky Mountains as a recorder and instrument man on the triangulation of the 39th parallel by the United States Coast and Geodetic Survey for a few months before settling down to the further study of my profession of landscape architecture as an assistant of my father's firm. Or perhaps he came with an eye to expanding the Colorado work prospects for the firm. The Olmsted brothers subsequently did work in the Denver Civic Center, the Denver Mountain Park System, and the Colorado College in Colorado Springs. But come he did, and after the BCIA engaged him, FLO Jr. visited Boulder for 10 days in May of 1908, and he toured Boulder by bicycle, met with the BCIA, gave talks to the Real Estate Exchange in Boulder and Denver, met with the university president Baker and other university officials, hiked with Eben Fine one day and Mrs. Gardner and her husband-to-be John J. P. Odell another, went over the mountain reservation with Dr. Baird and city engineer Fair. He went over proposed takings around town with Dr. Baird and W.W. Parse, and gave a public lecture using lantern slides on park's function at the university. He found Boulder very picturesque in detail. When people in Boulder talk about the Olmsted Plan, they are usually talking about two things. One, a report entitled The Improvement of Boulder, Colorado, Report to the City Improvement Association, dated November 9, 1908. It was initially shared with the BCIA and their allies, but not published until March of 1910, and to a plan of improvements, a lithograph on a base map created by local cartographer Henry Drum, illustrating proposed parks, roads, widenings of roads, and parkways, also dated March 1910. The writing in the report is dense and verbose, and probably to many with a Western ear, overly professorial. The April 19, 1910 Boulder Daily Camera opined, like most professional men, Professor Olmsted has evidently measured the value of his work by the prolixity of his report, though it doubtless contains much of value. We shall refer to the report from time to time, if ever given time to read it. His primary role was to advise the BCIA on a plan of improvements that they would champion, but with an eye to changing the minds of other townsfolk as well. Olmsted report covered a wide variety of topics, presumably reflecting the specific interests of the BCIA and townspeople in general. These included all things streets, waterways, including Boulder's creeks and ditches, and the issue of flooding, park locations, public buildings, sewage and signs, and public administration. Olmsted's focus was on improvements to be made within the public realm and not on private property. Zoning was not to come to Boulder until 1928 through the work of another planning consultant, Saco Rink de Boer. In the early 1900s, Boulder was doing a poor job of securing rights-of-way within developments that would be necessary for establishing connections to the surrounding territory, and these links are shown quite prominently on the plan. The plan shows the proposed development location of Newlands Park and Canyon Park, which were ultimately developed, and a park on what was known as Lover's Hill, which was not. The western boundary of the city is shown as solid green as a city park. This is the precursor to Boulder's present open space and mountain park system. Some of the mountain park had already been dedicated to Boulder by the federal government, but much remained to be acquired. The broad east-west swath drawn along Boulder Creek shows the intent of developing both formal parks and also leaving land in a natural state along the whole of Boulder Creek as it flows through the city for park and flood protection purposes. Olmsted made recommendations for acquisitions that the city could make, and a park and street dedication requirement for new annexations was adopted. In order to secure the support of the landowners and developers, he made the argument that such dedications would improve the value of property beyond any losses in land area. There were also other projects that he worked on directly or oversaw. In addition to relatively minor engagements on 2 residences, he provided significant input on street design and paving, the design of 2 bridges spanning Boulder Creek, planting plans for 2 public schools, a boundary study for Newland Park, and engineering studies for drainage and sewerage at a time when Boulder's public works were primitive and in need of great improvement. He is best known locally as the inspiration for the treatment of land along Boulder Creek, in both more formal parks near today's civic area and through its run through Boulder in the form of a multi-purpose greenway. This 1923 plan here envisioned a memorial to those who served in and who had lost their lives in World War I, the location for a city hall, an athletic field, and a park and pathway improvements. Due to the vagaries of citizen sentiment and legal judgment, a successful bond measure to fund the project was then struck down by these courts at the state level, and then failed at the ballot box on a second try. This lack of funding led to a much smaller park in the area bounded by present-day Broadway, Canyon, 13th, and Arapahoe, known, not too oddly, as Central Park. The land had been owned by the railroad and was leased by the city in 1921 and acquired in 1933. Olmsted's design shows plantings concentrated along its perimeter, with a greensward created in the interior to the benefit of the person within the park. Photographs of Boulder Central Park taken in 1929 have the characteristic starkness of newly minted parks. Today, Central Park has become one of the most valuable pieces of green space in Boulder because of its proximity to the downtown, its location along Boulder Creek, and its role as a prime location of public events and gatherings. One of the positive legacies of the Olmsted Plan was as inspiration for advocates of Boulder's Greenbelt, its open space system. In 1967, Greenbelt proponents reprinted the 1910 Olmsted Report as part of their campaign. A 1-cent sales tax measure that included 4/10 of a cent for open space and 6/10 of a cent for transportation improvement skillfully brought together the environmental and business communities in common cause. And Boulder became the first community in the country to pass a tax measure for the purchase of open space in 1967. The system today includes more than 46,000 acres of protected land. As with open space and mountain parks, city leaders and planners found inspiration in Olmsted's vision, and a new plan for Boulder Creek was developed in 1984. True to his vision of a landscape that served multiple purposes, funding came from multiple city departments, including parks, transportation, and public works. By taking a deliberate, opportunistic, and incremental approach of securing rights of access and creating safe passage, the Creek Plan was initially completed in 1987. It is a 5-mile-long, uninterrupted path along Boulder Creek. Today, the overall system consists of multi-use paths along all 14 of Boulder Creek's tributaries as well. In September 2013, Boulder got a wake-up call about the impact of severe flooding on Boulder Creek and many of its tributaries. 8 days of rain led to a 1,000-year rain event, which led to a 100-year flood. The performance of the Boulder Creek improvements and greenway system was evident. In the aftermath of the George Floyd murder and the reinvigoration of the Black Lives Matter movement, the city of Boulder convened a working group to address Boulder's lack of racial diversity. Boulder adopted its first racial equity plan in 2021. The plan includes a racial history of the city of Boulder. It points to a history of deliberate discrimination against indigenous peoples and immigrant people of color, including Asian railroad workers, African Americans, and Mexicans. The history states that the height limit, the green belt that limited outward expansion of housing, and the fact that a significant portion of the city is zoned exclusively for single-family development all directly contribute to the high cost of housing in Boulder. Connecting the dots, they point out that high housing costs continue to impact who can afford to live in Boulder, thereby decreasing diversity. The 1910 Olmsted Plan explicitly calls for a city of fine homes, and Boulder's 1928 zoning reflects that. Housing affordability is an acute problem in Boulder today, with the pressures of a growing university, a surplus of jobs to resident workers, and the overall attractiveness of the community. A recent documentary, This Is Not Who We Are, tackles the issue of discrimination against black people in particular and points to the Olmsted Plan as having set exclusivity in motion, as well as displacing both black and white poor people from Boulder Creek in favor of Olmsted's plan to protect it. So, did the Olmsted Plan exclude working people from Boulder's vision of a university town? He states in his 1910 report, he starts that report with a section entitled, "The Net Practical Result to be Aimed at." In planning practice today, this is akin to a vision statement, a declaration of what we wish our community to become. So as you can see on the slide, it was to create a perfect city of homes and to meet the needs of those people, to continue to be a local distributing center, to permit only manufacturing without noise, dirt, disorder, or annoyance, to allow some manufacturing to meet the needs of a city of homes, and to provide for suburban farming at the edge of the city. So it generally excludes manufacturing industry as a prime use of land, and in this he was in sync with his clients, the improvers. They wanted growth, but not industrial growth, wishing instead to grow the university enterprise and associated institutions like Chautauqua. For black workers, however, this transition meant fewer job opportunities. Historian Dan Corson notes for the period from 1870 to 1950, while the black population reached a high population mark of 166 in 1910, the jobs that they held were in decline, especially in railroads, hotels, and the decision to not expand the industrial base. Corson writes that this shift is being an important educational center meant that there was less tolerance for the working man, black or white. Now we look at the issue of displacement. So you can see in this slide an area of the land above Boulder Creek from 10th to 11th Street was colloquially and negatively referred to as the jungle. It was home to some of Boulder's brothels from the 1880s to around 1900, and also a district where the poor, both people of color and white, could find shelter. Looking at the 1910 Olmsted Plan document and the plan itself, when it came to the alignment of Boulder Creek Park of the jungle, Olmsted Jr. excluded the lots along Water Street from his proposed taking. But the jungle and the people who lived there faced other headwinds. The forces of the temperance movement joined with the improvers and others to elect a new city council in 1907. They campaigned on the notion that the future of the university was at risk if Boulder had a reputation as a saloon town. The council ordered saloons closed and passed an ordinance forbidding the sale of liquor. 1907 is often pointed to as the official end of prostitution, gambling, and saloons in Boulder. Local attitudes about the poor folks who made their home in the jungle were uniformly negative. So looking again at the 1923 plan, you can see that at that time, the proposal was for a continuous park improvement south of Water Street and north of Boulder Creek. So more research is needed here, but clearly the community vision for the development of a park along Boulder Creek had evolved from his more limited improvement suggested in the 1910 report to the active clearance of land. So we have been reminded in Elizabeth Hope Cushing's new biography of FLO Jr. of his own racism as exhibited by his advice to developers on the use of restrictive covenants to exclude non-Caucasians in master plan communities, including into communities within which he resided. This has been hard to square with his father's values concerning social justice. But one thing we have hopefully learned through all of the recent discussions on race and equity is the systemic nature of racism. It is hard to separate the worthy ends sought by the Boulder City Improvement Association from their built-in notions of just who should be the proper beneficiaries of those improvements, and so with their advisor, Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. And now I'd like to invite the next speakers. Thanks.
Hi. I am Chris-Ann Beckner. I'm an architectural historian with Historical Research Associates in the state of Washington. And with me today, Natalie Perrin, also an architectural historian. She's coming from Oregon. And if Peter asked you to travel 2,000 miles west keep going. We're going to get all the way to the very northwest edge of the country to talk about how the Olmsteds really did reach every corner of the U.S. Today, we're here to present a tale of two cities, preserving the Olmsted brothers' legacy in Seattle and Spokane, Washington. If you're familiar with the topography of Washington at all, it's this beautiful northwest paradise. And western Washington, very developed, and then you have an enormous mountain range, and on the other side of that, you have Spokane. So we have these two different urban areas that were newly connected by railroads. They had tremendous natural resources. They were a kicking off place for those who wanted to go find gold in the Yukon. So there was tremendous energy in these areas when we go back to about the beginning of the 20th century, about the same time Peter was talking about, to look how JCO worked with the cities of Seattle and Spokane. So while Frederick Law Olmsted could be said to have made his name as the father of landscape architecture in the East, his nephew and stepson, John Charles Olmsted, who we refer to as JCO in our documentation, he made his name in the West, where young cities, newly connected to the rest of the nation by railroad, were suddenly expanding across miles of previously undeveloped wilderness. Just a couple of examples of the kinds of trees and landscapes that JCO might have seen when he got to the Seattle area in 1903. Enormous stands of trees, and then also we had these landscapes that were carved by water. So if you're familiar with the city of Seattle, you have the Puget Sound and the direction toward the Pacific on the west, and then you have Lake Washington sort of carving out the east side of the city. So you have these two bodies of water sort of around this hourglass that is the city of Seattle. So it was JCO's recommendations that allowed local governments to race to preserve some of the natural areas in these regions before they were consumed by development. JCO prepared citywide park plans for numerous Northwest cities, including Portland in Oregon and Seattle in 1903. His plan for Spokane was completed in 1908. In these plans, the Olmsted brothers revolutionized not only park design, but also park funding, acquisition, management. Engaging with Northwest cities when they were still in their youth, he was able to design citywide park systems ahead of sprawling construction. He could identify key locations, drive their acquisition before they were lost, and then leave these systems in the hands of skilled, autonomous commissions that could oversee the creation of the massive public undertakings that were citywide park systems. The resulting park systems define these cities today. We consider the Northwest sort of an outdoor playground, and it's partly because of the lands that were preserved at this time. Am I not advancing? There we go. So we were talking about the city of Seattle. Sorry about that. And you can see in this document, this map that has the red lines, these were the parks and parkways that the Olmsteds envisioned for the city of Seattle. And this is in 1903, 1904, when we first had cars. So these were really bicycle paths, carriage paths, walking paths. And you can see that they connect through the entirety of the city of Seattle. So JCO was obviously a product of his family. He joined his father's firm in 1875, and he worked closely with Olmsted Sr. until the elder gentleman retired in 1895. JCO then formed a partnership with his younger half-brother, Frederick Olmsted Jr. The pair went on to manage an era of expansion, growing the small family firm into the largest landscape architecture and planning office in the United States. So one of the things we found really interesting when we started looking into these city plans, when preparing the Portland Plan, JCO compiled a list of guiding principles for municipal clients. They reflected the needs of young cities, garden cities, park cities, cities that preserved the lands on the edges of waterways, and those with views of distant mountains. These principles were simple, but potentially radical, focusing on the importance of municipal parks, as in this quote, "All agree that parks not only add to the beauty of a city and to the pleasure of living in it, but are exceedingly important factors in developing the healthfulness, morality, intelligence, and business prosperity of its residents." A lot of these things I think we've seen before. They go all the way back to Olmsted Sr. But when you start talking about business prosperity, there I think we see JCO sort of coming to his own a little bit. He also talked about the duty of citizens towards parks. that every inhabitant of a city owes to it in return for benefits and advantages derived from it, certain duties not specifically compulsory, according to law. Among such duties is that of aiding in every possible way to make the city more beautiful, more agreeable to live in and work in, and more attractive to strangers, visitors, people coming to share the economic growth of this city. While there are many things, both small and great, which may contribute to the beauty of a great city, we're only interested in great cities right now. Unquestionably, one of the greatest is a comprehensive system of parks and parkways. And this is where we get to the idea that it's not individual parks we're talking about citywide systems that are going to grow with the cities they're developed for. Parks should be defined in advance. As in the case of almost every complex work composed of varied units, economy, efficiency, symmetry, and completeness are likely to be secured only when the system as a whole is planned comprehensively and the purposes to be accomplished defined clearly in advance. You can see him making his case. These local governments are going to have to commit to citywide systems, even while they're trying to come up with fire suppression for the first time, water systems for the first time. They're growing into newly annexed lands. They have to treat cities like any other form of infrastructure. They need to invest in it. JCOs insist on inclusion and connectivity of all park types, and that those parks be located to take advantage of natural scenery and sanitation. These were not the revolutionary ideas. He saved his most radical ideas for park management, asserting that acquisition of parks and parklands was essential at any cost. With the assumption that land would continually rise in value and increase taxes by raising the value of adjoining lands, JCO purported parks should be, quote, both occasionally and continuously, unquote, improved by loans, special assessments, and annual taxation. One of the other quotes, a city having many or extensive opportunities for parks and parkways should promptly avail itself of them, even at serious financial sacrifice. The land for parks should be paid for by long-term loans, because parks are better assets when the loan by which they have been acquired becomes payable than school buildings, fire engine houses, city halls, street improvements, and most other things for which cities borrow money. So he was asking them again to treat them like a priority from the beginning. I feel like I'm a little off on my slides here. Sorry about that. JCL also insisted that parks be treated differently than other city assets. The expense of creating a park system necessitated management by a small board of independent, unpaid commissioners. These individuals should have experience. They should insist that only trained professionals improve the parks they managed, and they should protect the park system from the politics of rotating administrations. This was a pretty radical idea. You could have administrations coming and going in management of a city, but the Parks Commission had to stay independent, and they had to keep the institutional knowledge that allowed them to make good choices for these resources as they grew. It was this practical approach to management, on top of his inherited sense of design and his innate appreciation for the water, mountains, hills, native plants, and shorelines of the Pacific Northwest, that made JCO the most significant park designer of his era in our region. So I'm going to invite Natalie up to talk a little bit about specific park development in Spokane, and we're doing a little bit of comparing and contrasting. Seattle and Spokane are slightly different, but they have some similarities and really show how JCO worked in the region.
Thank you, Chrisanne. Hi, everybody. So JCO's principles of parks management could only be implemented by progressive local governments. And in Spokane, JCO found a young city with nearly endless park potential and a local government actively preserving parklands. Here we have a couple of images of early parks in Spokane, Liberty Park in around 1900, and a playground at A.M. Cannon Park around 1905. As a parent, I tried not to look very closely at that picture. In 1907, a newly appointed board of park commissioners took control of approximately 173 acres of parklands, about 2/3 of which had yet to be developed. Aubrey White was named president of the board of the park commissioners. White had spent a great deal of time in New York City and was familiar with Central Park and other works associated with the famed Olmsted name. White invited JCO to Spokane, and the Olmsted brothers produced a report for the city in 1908. White listened to and adhered to JCO's radical park management plans and did not release the plan to the public until 1913. This afforded the city time to acquire land before real estate developers and landowners could raise their prices based on the plan's recommendations. By doing so, White oversaw the acquisition of hundreds of acres of new parks for Spokane, and by the time the Olmsted Report was released in 1913, the park system had grown from that initial 173 acres to about 1,934 acres. Interestingly, the city of Spokane did not separate park planning from city planning. City planning was an evolving discipline during the early 20th century, and Spokane did take a formal approach to its own city plan. While Spokane did establish the City Planning Commission in 1918, for its first 6 or 7 years, it was essentially an adjunct of the Park Board. Here we have an image of Manitou Park, which we'll talk a little bit more about later, from around 1911. In the years following the release of the Olmsted Brothers plan, Spokane diversified its recreational opportunities, adding playgrounds, public pools, and golf courses. By the late 1920s, the city was believed to hold the greatest amount of park land per capita in the entire nation. The park system continued to evolve through the 1970s, and in 1974, the city completed one of the Olmsted Report's most important remaining recommendations and created a riverfront park near the falls in downtown Spokane. With that in mind, I'm going to turn it back over to Chrisanne.
You can tell that we have our regional preferences. I'm a Seattle fan. So beginning in 1902, the Seattle Board of Park Commissioners, via correspondence with Percy Jones and JCO, laid out some urgent goals for parks. They wanted to secure adequate appropriation to acquire land for parkways and boulevards, perform the necessary land surveys, and hire a consulting expert. JCO and Jones, concurrent with their trip to Portland, Oregon, while working on their city plan, ventured to Seattle in April 1903. The Olmsted brothers submitted their final parks report in June 1903 and were clearly impressed with Seattle's natural features. As such, the Seattle plan recommended not only a comprehensive system, but also a plan with which all future private and public land subdivisions should conform. They also specified individual approaches to parks based on the specific natural landscape. The firm submitted its Seattle report, a comprehensive system of parks and parkways, in 1903. As with other savvy city governments, including Spokane's, Seattle kept the report under wraps until it could acquire a great deal of the land identified for future parks. Unlike in Spokane, the Seattle Board of Parks Commissioners faced an uphill battle in securing funding through the City Council. After wrestling unsuccessfully for executive authority, the board requested independence by securing signatures that would bring a new city charter amendment to a public vote. In March 1904, what became known as the Park Amendment passed by 140 votes, and the Park Board was suddenly free to take firm control of funding, acquiring, and improving the city's parks, following JCO's recommendations. The Seattle Board of Park Commissioners stayed in regular contact with the Olmsted brothers, and it resulted in a number of reports. 1907, Seattle begins to annex a lot of lands to the north and the south. As early as 1908, they bring JCO back for a supplemental report in which JCO provided additional recommendations for park acquisitions in these newly annexed areas of the city. In those supplemental reports and the reports that would come, new principles for future development took shape, and there was a strong emphasis on playgrounds and playfields and making parks accessible to everyone and putting them really close to residential development so that everyone could reach a park within his daily life. And this is familiar from Olmsted plans in the past, right? There's that healthfulness element, that idea that it's good for growth, children, everybody to have access to parks. But there was another thing going on in Seattle that this photo really illustrates. In 1909, Seattle hosted the World's Fair. And so it was the Alaska Yukon Pacific Exposition, and they asked JCO to put together a plan for the World's Fair, which he did at the future location at the University of Washington. So what you're looking at here is the concourse for the exposition, and the important detail of this is how it faces the mountain. Mount Rainier, if you've ever been to Washington or the Puget Sound region, you'll notice that people say the mountain is out, it's out. It means the clouds have cleared for just the smallest amount of time, and you can actually see Mount Rainier. JCO planned the World's Fair to face directly towards that view. In the years following, the Olmsted brothers remained in contact with Seattle's park planners, made a number of visits, drew up a number of plans, both for public spaces and private spaces, and authored a number of additional reports. The Olmsted legacy in Seattle spanned over 30 years, included 37 individual parks and playgrounds, and resulted in an Olmsted Park system that is one of the best preserved and best designed in the United States. We've split this slide a little bit so that you can really see how much boulevard space is used to connect the individual parks, and the way that it stretches all the way down through the city of Seattle. So there's one more thing that we want to tell you about, which is a little bit about how HRA got into this work. So I'm going to ask Natalie to come back up one more time.
I want to take a moment to go back to something that Chrisanne just stated, and that is that in Seattle, the Olmsted legacy spanned 30 years and 37 park and playground plans. We started getting involved in this in 2015 when the City of Spokane contracted our firm, HRA, to prepare a multiple property documentation for the city's parks and boulevards. Now, Spokane's comprehensive legacy of parks and city planning acknowledges not only the Olmsted brothers' influence, but also the people, policies, and practices that came both before and after the 1907 report. The MPD, which is entitled City of Spokane Parks and Boulevards 1891 to 1974, tells the city's entire story of park development, establishing property types and registration requirements that cover not only the Olmsted designed and recommended parks, but also parks with significance for associations with local leaders and local city planning efforts. HRA listed Spokane's Manitou Park and Boulevard as a historic district under that MPD. Conversely, following the completion of the City of Spokane MPD, HRA completed a similar document for the City of Seattle. In partnership with local advocacy groups such as the Friends of Olmsted Parks, HRA was directed to confine the document to those parks that were directly associated with the Olmsted plans for Seattle parks and boulevards. Now, as I mentioned, Seattle had a much more robust engagement with the Olmsted firm than Spokane did over a much longer period of time. The context for the Seattle MPD does acknowledge the important work of planners who predated the Olmsted brothers, but resource types and criteria for National Register listing were confined to those with a direct association to the Olmsted plans. The resulting MPD, which is entitled Seattle's Olmsted Parks and Boulevards 1903 to 1968, provided guidance for the evaluation of the collection of park resources in Seattle specifically associated with the Olmsted influence. HRA listed Lake Washington Boulevard as a historic district under the MPD. Lake Washington Boulevard is the city's prime example of a boulevard and parkway. It's a designed historic landscape that links small parks and views by a drive that creates a single aesthetic. The boulevard was in part designed by the Olmsted brothers and was directly influenced by JCO's design recommendations. The comprehensive nature of the Olmsted influence on landscapes varies with each city. However, the role of the Olmsted brothers in furthering the principles founded by Frederick Olmsted Sr. are clearly visible in those communities that benefit from their planning expertise. The Olmsted brothers designed park systems to harmonize with the wild spaces and open landscapes, highlighting the visible distance and those lakes or mountain views as a means of giving visitors a deeper park experience that could only be seen in the geography and topography of the Pacific Northwest. However, it was their emphasis on designing citywide systems of parks and boulevards, which were publicly paid for and independently managed, that have allowed these park systems to grow with each city, providing a legacy that both cities hope to preserve for the next 100 years. Now, we've given you a very shallow dive into a very deep pool of two cities and have not touched on any of the social justice and reform issues that I think are probably going to be a theme of this conference. But if you'd like to take a deeper dive, both the multiple property documentations and the National Register listings are publicly available, of course, through the Keeper. And thank you.
Thank you to our speakers. That was really terrific and fun for me to see the West. Yay. I'd like to open up the floor to see if anyone has comments and invite our speakers up front. Anybody with a question? I see Isaac. Into the microphone, please.
I'd like to hear more about how you worked with the State Historic Preservation Office on these things, and whether you've been able to use those documents to add properties after the initial effort.
Great question, thank you. Yes, so both of these are in Washington State. So one State Historic Preservation Office, which is the Department of Archaeology and Historic Preservation, is the SHPO in Washington. We worked very closely with them on both MPDs and listings. We have so far listed only one park in Seattle. It is the Lake Washington Parks and Boulevards park behind the MPD. However, in Spokane, we have done additive listings. So initially, the first park to be listed behind the MPD was Manitou Park, and we have since listed Coeur d'Alene Park as well. It was a very robust, long process for both MPDs. And we were very fortunate that we have great relationships with our SHPO and also had a great team behind us. It wasn't just us. The other stakeholders that were involved were also incredibly wonderful to work with. But it did take time.
If I can add one detail to that, we also had a lot of help from the National Park Service, who has, of course, landscape experts who were helping us design the way the document needed to look, what it needed to cover, how it could be used in the future. So we feel like we really relied on regular state and federal to get the document right.
Yes, coming from a city which was the site of the very first Olmsted Vaux citywide park plan, it's always fascinating to hear about other cities that have had citywide park systems developed as part of the Olmsted legacy, but also, hearing about Frederick Law Olmsted Jr.'s role in city planning, going beyond the parks realm. So Frederick Law Olmsted Jr. had to deal with something his father never had to address, which was the automobile. So I'm wondering how he incorporated that or dealt with that in his the park systems and city plans that he developed. How did he modify or adapt his father's principles to deal with the automobile?
So in 1910, I think the number of registered vehicles in Boulder was 66. So it wasn't something that was out there, right? But obviously was something that they perhaps could see coming. The issue for Boulder was that all the streets were dirt at the time he came to town. So there's an extensive body of work about what the proper paving material would be and how to maintain streets and as a stable kind of surface for all sorts of traffic. But it is a good curiosity. But I think that when you start to look at all the work they did on streets, it's probably fortunate that they were thinking about the street as an amenity, that's something that was pretty wide and could accommodate vehicles as they came in. But at the moment that he arrived in Boulder, he ran around town on a bicycle, and there were 66 cars around town. So it wasn't something that was front and center, at least in that planning work.
Hi, I'm interested in the statement, I think it was about Seattle being one of the best preserved park systems. And not to make any other city feel bad or be competitive, but it was kind of a trend, at least in our area, but I think not unique to Boston, that if someone needed to build a school or a hospital, it often was taken from parkland. And just wondered, are you making that statement based on the fact that the park is still pretty intact, or is there a reference where people can look at lost parkland and kind of dig deeper into that question?
I think one of the things that we wanted to make clear is that Seattle had, for 100 years, tried to keep hold of those parklands, had successfully kept hold of this system, had not broken through it to remove sections of boulevard, or had not transferred parks into another use. So when we think of it as one of the best preserved systems, it's because you can still move through all of these planted boulevards. You can still find these views over Lake Washington. A lot of this land is still being used as it was intended by the JCO plan. Of course.
I'll just add one other piece too. So the Olmsted Legacy in Seattle extended through the 1940s, and they were actively having the Olmsted brothers come and design plans, design parks. Shortly after that, there was, well, I guess it wasn't shortly after that, but throughout the 40s, 50s, and 60s, there wasn't a ton that was done to parks in Seattle. In 1974, forward thrust is where I'm going with this.
1967.
67, sorry, I'm getting my Spokane and Seattle. 74 was Riverside, okay. In 1967, forward thrust, which was a citywide bond. Yes, please.
Countywide, if I may.
Countywide.
I'm sorry, I'm not going to bore you with a bunch of forward thrusts, but this is one of my favorite things that ever happened. It was a lifestyle improvement sort of bond for all of King County, and it developed in just acreage of parks all through King County. And it also brought the parks departments into conversation about what to do with their existing legacies. And as Natalie mentioned, the parks hadn't received a lot of attention, or really a lot of love, through maybe the 40s, through the 50s, 60s. But with this new influx of money, there was the ability to improve, maintain, take another look at these parks, and people started digging back into the documentation. It's actually a pretty important period. In the 80s, the Seattle Parks Department started to go back and look at these plans, take another look. The Friends of the Olmsted Parks and a lot of friend organizations came to be in the next couple of decades, and all of a sudden Seattle realized that it had this jewel that it had sort of forgotten about for a couple of decades, and it wanted to invest a lot more money and time into. And so I think that there's a celebration happening now because they were not changing anything for some period of time, and now we get to actually celebrate it anew, and there's a lot of new documentation and research and excitement around the parks and what we can do to continue to grow them.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask a quick question. Are there any questions from online? No questions. Okay, great. Anybody else? One last question. Yay.
I've worked in Louisville, and Chickasaw and Shawnee Park were racial specific. Chickasaw was for the black populace, and Shawnee was for the white. These are Olmsted Legacy places, and as we've said, they are at the behest of the clients. So I'm wondering if in the West we had gender, racial, whatever, segregated open spaces created by the Olmsted firm. I had, the opportunity very early in my career to walk Lake Washington Boulevard with Tony Walmsley and work out there and see a lot of the system, but maybe in Boulder or Spokane or Seattle, there was a degree of segregation, either in law or in action.
So I think I shared with you the number of black residents of Boulder, 161 in 1910. So I think if Dan Corson's work on this issue in our town really points to the fact that the black population was not an economic threat to the white population, and their numbers were small, so that there wasn't a feeling of separation. And generally, the population's mixed, but it was relatively small. I will say, in sort of the light of, so the Boulder Creek Park exists now, right? So here we are today. And there are certainly segments of the park that are claimed by different groups of people. Certainly the homeless are still present along Boulder Creek. Our Mexican community uses certain parks for weekend gatherings, that type of thing. Some of them are very celebratory. some of them are kind of sad that these park spaces have to be used in the ways that they are, that people don't have adequate housing, for instance. So I don't know, it's a complicated question, but Boulder is not racially diverse enough really to point to as sort of a strong segregation, the kind of picture that you're pointing to, but certainly there are places that are claimed by different groups for their park purposes.
So thank you for the question, first of all, because it's something that we have to look at, obviously, if we're doing analysis. And one of the saddest details of history in the Northwest is how government limited racial diversity throughout the 19th and early 20th century. And redlining was part of that, but there were also really, really terrible sundowner laws early on. People working on railroads had to get out of town, even though they were actually on the railroad. They couldn't stay overnight in places like Eugene, Oregon. There's a ton of history on housing discrimination that's really terrible. So because you're looking at a city that's not racially diverse, I mean, I hate to say it, but I think the Northwest was designed to not be racially diverse. The laws actually enforced that situation. So when Olmsted came, he didn't really have to think very hard about segregating in terms of race. In terms of gender, the things that you find in the documentation are him talking about young families and needing access to spaces that are open, and this sort of the value on the mind, on the intellect, to have access to open spaces. A lot of things that I think you would see in Olmsted Senior's work as well, but not a segregation necessarily. But it was thought that young families, women, would be the people using the parks during the day. And I think we're running out of time.
Oh, no. We're okay. We have like 7 more minutes. Great.
I just wanted to add one more thing about that question, sorry. This isn't specific to Olmsted, but in Spokane, because the context that we were able to write in Spokane is a little bit more robust and not specifically focused on the Olmsteds. There are some rays of light, perhaps. So Glover Field, for example, is one of the parks in downtown Spokane, and in the 1920s it held the first Indian Congress, which was an attempt to invite the indigenous population into the community and start having a diverse dialogue. Now, that dialogue has ebbed and flows over the years and is certainly not a perfect example, but there are some examples of sort of rays of light with that.
I have a very simple question. It's my understanding that your National Register documentation was funded in part by the State Department of Transportation. Is that correct?
In Seattle, yes.
Well, a couple of things. One is an observation, just because Seattle's a city I know well, and you'd never mentioned Dawson, and the work that happens after JCO dies is Dawson. The 1909 is Dawson, the exposition. He's responsible for a great many things. But in talking about things that are incursions into the park, where would you consider the entry of the museum into Volunteer Park in that process? And then you've also got, although I don't know its exact date, the reservoir that ended up and then is now since been, will we cover it, will we not cover it, et cetera?
Exactly right. Thank you so much for mentioning Dawson. He absolutely spent decades working on the park plans that JCO put into place to do a lot of development, and in the 40s was very important to the Arboretum and other locations in Seattle. So thank you so much for reminding us to bring up his name. In terms of inclusions in the park, Volunteer Park actually predates the Olmsteds. So there are parks that were already developed, already part of a system when the Olmsteds came along, and JCO made some recommendations for Volunteer Park. There were huge fights over how to use that space, right? I think that you're getting to, and the museum's been put there, and there have been changes in that park. But we don't think of that as specifically a JCO park, even though he did do designs for it, and they were part of the plan. He was one of many designers who can take credit for parts of Volunteer Park. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Okay, we have time for one more, and if nobody has a question, I have a question. So I'd like to ask our panelists, I think maybe starting with Boulder, how this historical research that you do helps us think about our role in the future and overcoming some of the issues that these cities face.
Yeah, we have a local historian, Patty Limerick, who runs a center called, and her tagline is turning hindsight into foresight. And I think that's one thing that we should all be engaged in. And I suppose, you know, it might be trite to say, but one way to battle exclusivity is to promote inclusivity, right? So lots of representation issues there in terms of the profession, the political realm, but even development itself and professionals in conservation, that type of thing. But I think for planners, what we've been exploring really is how do you build inclusivity into systems that have been used to exclude? So zoning, for instance. So how do you upzone but capture the value of that new density you provide to provide for things like affordable housing? Or reforming taxation so that it works to provide benefits for the larger community. For Boulder, it's a town that has lots of pressures that contribute to the increasing unaffordability of housing. It's a very attractive place, but we've also designated lots of land for job growth, and we haven't provided the housing for those workers. So we had a mayor who talked about every time we add a job to Boulder and don't provide a housing unit, we're contributing to regional sprawl. And I think that that's sort of the right frame to think about this in. It's not just the island of Boulder and what happens within its boundaries. That's really important, but it's what happens regionally. So Boulder can do a lot more to provide more housing and maybe not pursue all that job growth.
So speaking just for Seattle, and this is a really recent development, we are now looking at equity as central to any analysis we do. So there's a new comp plan being developed now, and we're being asked to do some context development for it, to help them with some alternatives analysis. As you may know, the West has become phenomenally expensive to live in.
What is the comp plan?
Comprehensive plan to drive the city planning for the city staff for some period, usually 5 to 10 years. So they're doing an environmental impact statement on the comp plan to make sure that we include things like equity in our analysis. And we're actually being told, directed by city staff, to make that the lens that we use in our analysis, not just to include it in our historic context, which is important, but to actually use it in all alternatives analysis so that we're not missing it. And they've said that out loud in meeting after meeting after meeting. They've written it into contracts. So I don't think it's necessarily a process that's very far along or has been used in all versions of city planning, but I think it's something that cities are committing to in the West now.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for your great questions. I think we're ready to adjourn for lunch. And can somebody remind me are you going to do that? Turn it over to Anthony.
Hello, welcome to Boston Lunching. Once you step outside the front doors you came in, you'll have two options, left or right. Left will take you sort of into the Seaport District. There's the sexy new real estate over there, some good, maybe more casual places. There's some bakeries, that kind of stuff. Turn right, and you're heading back towards the city, the Rose Kennedy Greenway, which is the thing to see since y'all are here and y'all are kind of in the landscapes. Along there are there's some sandwich shops, there's some other sit-down restaurants. There's a new food court, I want to say the High Street place, thank you, which is a sort of glamorous food court. If you want a real food court, South Station has some McDonald's and stuff like that. So those are your options. Ask around for other folks. We will be back here at 1:45. Next presentation is at 1:45, so please be back. Thank you. Adjourned.